welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us, we have a special guest, Dr. Vivek Mishra. He's the deputy director of the Strategic Studies Program and fellow focused on the Americas at the Observer Research Foundation. He is also a visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation of America, and we'll be discussing the Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to the United States, especially his meeting with President Donald Trump, as well as senior figures in the U.S. government, the outcomes of that meeting, and the development of U.S.-India diplomacy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's begin by actually introducing the audience a little bit about the Observer Research Foundation. What is it? What does it do?
So, I mean, ORF is the largest think tank of India. So first thing first, first thing first, thank you, Irina, for having me. I think it's a pleasure to be at Washington Outsider. So ORF is basically the largest think tank of India on public policy and international relations and strategic affairs. And we have various offices. We have a center in DC. We have a center in Dubai. In India, we have in multiple centers in Mumbai, Kolkata, and Delhi. So we are an expanding think tank of India, and we also do the yearly Raisina dialogue, which is that's us. But broadly, we are also into public policy. We are into governance issues and urban issues, for instance, but primarily a international relations and strategic affairs think tank.
That's fascinating, and I'm so glad that there's a big focus on the Americas and that is being studied, and that is certainly a great way to connect the audiences to think things outside the United States. There is sometimes too much of a Washington focus in those circles, which is also unfortunately sometimes reflects on our policies as well. So let's start by talking about this visit. Let's talk about its timing. Why do you think the visit was scheduled for so early after the administration's being sworn in? And what do you think was the major concern on India's side when scheduling the visit?
Well, thank you. The order of the visit was actually was reflective of the priority that the Trump administration and the United States now accords to India, which is a key partner country of the United States. It also speaks of the importance that Trump himself, in his second administration, accords to certain things in priority, which is trade. And from that angle, India is one of the largest countries that has trade surpluses with the United States. India has about 36 billion at this point.
Sorry, you froze up.
Donald Trump, and I think that priority is itself in many ways reflective of what the relationship today stands for. Now there was some signaling, there was some reciprocal tariff, but there was also some 25% aluminum tariff on a host of countries from which India was missing. So I think it's all in all, the visit was a great was great in terms of both substance and also in terms of signaling. Overall, that's what I think the result. And we can talk about the specifics of the visit in terms of what substance and the areas that were discussed, the domains that were discussed, the new emphasis that were added, clearly speak of an elevation in the relationship.
So I'd like, before we get into the details of the visit itself, We know that the relationship between India and the US has been growing for some years. One of the biggest issues, of course, has been the concern about checking China's power, and that's been a focus for both countries. But uh, we have seen several major breakthroughs under the Biden administration. At the same time, we have seen that the Trump administration mm, has been trying to distinguish itself from its predecessor. How do you think it? Do you think that has had an impact on the tone of the visit and on the general priorities, or do you think there's going to be a lot of continuity in in the relationship?
So let me put it this way. I mean, there's bound to be a great degree of continuity in the relationship, primarily because the relationship is now structural and it cannot be weaned away. I mean, the parts of it are now entangled with the bone and the meat is really in its place. So you're going to see that across presidencies and across the bipartisanship within the U.S. Congress, you have the India caucus now. On the top of the India caucus, you have the Quad caucus now. So there are various structures that have pulled this relationship together, and I don't see any precedent, regardless of how out of the orbit that presidency is. And the extremist form of that can be seen in Donald Trump too. But I think even that presidency will have to go through certain continuities, and that we saw during the visit. Now, if you look at the some of these emphasis of the Biden administration, for example, the focus on critical and emerging tech. For example, the focus on Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific the Indo-Pacific security. I think all of these resonated again with the Trump 2 administration. He may have given a Trumpian imprint to it. He may have given a different swing to it. For example, the ISET was named as trust. All those kinds of things have happened. But I think the continuity bit is a strong reminder that the relationship remains and that the relationship today has a bipartisan support within the US Congress.
That is one of those rare moments of bipartisanship that I think are very much worth underscoring and celebrating. And having said that, let's look at the specifics and the details. Um, it's interesting that the visit actually started with a meeting with the newly appointed national security director of national intelligence. And of course, there were a couple of key points, key priorities for India in that meeting. Could you elaborate on them and their outcomes and what you expect to happen next?
So I think that the meeting with Prime Minister Modi between Prime Minister Modi and DNI, the US DNI Tulsi Gabbard, was very important in many ways. But let me take a step back and go to the inauguration of Donald Trump too, where the foreign minister of India was one of the invited Quad members.
I'm sorry, you're freezing up. If you could just repeat that, please.
The domestic sphere was between the Quad countries, emphasizing that the relationship with Quad countries remains strong. Now, let me come back to your question on DNI. I think there are two aspects to look at that meeting. Hindu rights within the United States. She's been a great cultural enthusiast for everything that India today is. Um, so I think from that angle, it is really important. That meeting had a strong, uh, resonating impact of culture there. The second is the the concerns, some of the intelligence concerns that India has, and to be able to get a statement from Donald Trump if you look at the joint statement, there was a
Mhm.
statement that both countries will not tolerate or will counter any any efforts to efforts that challenge the two countries' territorial integrity and sovereignty. And now that, to me, is a direct statement against groups like the Khalistan movement within the United
Mhm.
States. So I think that's a step up from the Biden administration, where we could, there was a different concern, a different stance altogether of the government.
And there was a mention of a terrorist supporter who India was trying to extradite. What was that story about, and why, in your opinion, was it being held up?
So Tahabur Rana, whose story is that he's linked to doing the recce, facilitating in many ways the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, which was one of the most gruesome attacks that happened, the terrorist attacks that happened in India in 2008. And I think since then, the Indian side has been wanting an extradition of Tahabur Rana. And despite an agreement with the United States, there has been a judicial blockade towards that for various reasons. And then I think the Trump administration came and made sure that there can be zero tolerance on the issue of terrorism. And if anybody is, any entity is threatening the other country from its soil, then it's the obligation of the partner to extradite that. So I think it was a great victory in many ways because it's been in the waiting for long. The second issue is that the counterterrorism framework on the joint statement really is strong. And I think it's a step up that if activities like this can be enhanced, then the cooperative framework on counterterrorism at the global level really can expand. And one area where that can happen is the CCIT, which is Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, which is an Indian initiative at the United Nations, and we are looking for support there. And the United States could be a great partner in that effort.
And on the bilateral level, how do you see this new dimension to the partnership working out? In what specific direction and what types of cooperation do you expect to see as the next steps as a follow-up to the announcements at this visit?
Yeah, I mean, at the bilateral level,
Mm-hmm.
we have the there are many things that were announced. I mean, the first is the U.S.-India new give. Uh, I hope my video is clear.
It's
Because
freezing up a little bit. If you could just repeat your last comment.
yeah, I said at the bilateral level, one of the first important things was the compact, the U.S. and India 21st Century Compact, which is a new way by the Trump administration really to look at the security compact between the two sides. Now, essentially, that compact it says that it focuses on commerce, trade, and defense in a very new way. Now, it remains to be seen that how these areas are enhanced in cooperation the next few months. And I think most of these have been given the fall of 2025 as a deadline for some end products and for some concrete deliverables in this year. So I think we will have to wait until
Mm-hmm.
that year, until the fall of this year. But more importantly, among important initiatives, you have the Asia Initiative, which is a semiconductor and critical emerging tech sort of alliance partnership between the two countries. Then you have the Trust Partnership, which focuses on critical emerging tech, biotech, quantum, etc. New partnership. And then you have a host of initiative in the Indian Ocean. For example, the Meta-led initiative, which actually is very ambitious, and for in the next two decades, it seeks to connect 5 continents through undersea cables. Right, it's a great information data exercise that I think India and the US will be involved in, and it actually sees the first, I think, big tranche of investment by a private player in the Indian Ocean. And I think that's very important because if you have to have a counter framework to the Belt and Road Initiative, you will have to have private investors come in and play a big role. So to that extent, I think Meta initiative was really important. A lot of initiatives were announced in the areas of undersea cooperation, unmanned, uncrewed vehicles, autonomous systems inside sea and on the on above the sea, above the continent. So I think all in all, the Western Indian Ocean has been identified as a key area. The Middle East has been identified as an important part of a connectivity project that India and the US seeks by connecting Italy, Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. The last Trump administration called it the I2U2, but this time it has made a differentiation from the I2U2 and seeks a
Mm.
bigger connectivity by roping in Italy as well.
So how will that work, and why was Italy considered an important partner in this? Is it because of Meloni's leadership, or are there some additional factors, such as Italy's participation in energy initiatives that are more of a factor here?
So I think it's a combination of two or three factors. One is, of course, like you said, it's Italy has been pitching up its energy potential a lot.
Hmm.
The second is that its geography. It is in the heart of the Mediterranean region, and it can really employ its strategic advantage to transport to become this huge port that only Greece is, perhaps in the form of
Mm.
pariah. So I think Italy can pitch itself, and I think it has had that conversation with the United States, certainly, because when Musk visited, I'm sure there were some business deals that were talked about, what the two countries can do together. Plus, Melanie is also called the Trump whisperer of Europe, right? So I'm sure there's a great degree of camaraderie there. Now, the second is that the Trump administration is clear about augmenting its oil and energy produce, and it's looking for new markets. So where will it look? It will look to Asia, where China and India are the largest importers of oil. China obviously can't and won't buy much of US oil. Um, Therefore, it is looking at India, and the joint statement actually announced that the United States looks forward to becoming the largest supplier of crude and energy products to India. Whether or not that is possible is a different thing. But I think in terms of connectivity, in terms of end goals, this is the Middle East and the new connectivity project sort of sets itself up for that agenda.
I kind of want to, before we kind of get into a couple of these things more in depth, I wanted to go back to an old connectivity project suggested by the Biden administration, IMEC, which was disrupted by the Houthi attacks, which have now been paused. Do you see the Trump administration, or India for that matter, revisiting this concept and trying to revitalize and implement it practically? Or do you think that for political reasons it's basically dead and cannot be really revived to any scalable um, uh, uh,
So
way?
That's a great question. I think, Trump has no choice but to augment the Biden administration's steps and, not let them die, because
Mhm.
IMEC is what Trump is trying to do by roping in Italy is basically saying that IMEC was the Biden administration's imprint, and now here comes mine, and therefore has to be something different, and therefore Italy comes in. It probably becomes a uh, larger connectivity project. And the reason why the United States is actually wooing Saudi Arabia is because it wants Saudi Arabia to become that center of all this connectivity project, and work with Israel, its other partner in the region. Uh, there are various analyses as to why the United States doesn't trust the UAE and the Qatar in terms of the trust that it wants to build with Saudi Arabia. Um, Qatar is seen as somebody who's close to Hamas, and with everything that is going on in Middle East, it's not the right time to sort of pitch this idea to Qatar. UAE is, of course, sometimes seen as a country which has supported how the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and has a tense relationship with Saudi Arabia. And for all those reasons, and Saudi Arabia is a country which is looking for a better relationship with the United States. It is looking for a civil nuclear deal,
Mhm.
which the Biden administration actually came very close but did not commit to. And I think Trump administration, if Saudi Arabia ends up investing substantially within the United States, it could very well get a civil nuclear deal or a major partner, or a major defense partner status, which was given to UAE under the Biden administration. So I think for all those reasons, Trump is trying to augment whatever Biden left and say that here's my elevation to everything that Biden did, but it's a new thing.
So one of the logistical issues with the IMEC was that the burden of paying for all the costs of the ports, maintenance and unloading of all the deliveries would have been on Saudi Arabia. Do you think they they are currently as interested in this project as they were a couple of years ago? Or do you think things have changed in the region and they're looking towards a different way of uh, trade and a different way of aligning with the administration on other issues?
So two or three things. One is first, let me start by identifying the nature of the IMEC project or the project that
Mhm.
Trump seeks. It is a hugely complicated connectivity project in the sense that it involves, like you said, ships, rails, freight, road, multiple. So it's a multimodal connectivity. The problem with multimodal connectivity is that you will have to offload and unload, load and unload a lot many times more than you normally do in a straight, for example, a train, a freight ride. So that is the logistical bit of it. I think the logistics is one of the most challenging part. The second challenging part of this is what is happening in the region, the trust between the intra-regional trust between the Middle East countries. I think that's fallen apart because of what has happened over the last 2.5 years between Israel, Hamas, and Iran, etc. Iran is at the heart of the Chabahar project, right? Chabahar is actually sitting on the cusp of the Gulf, and it's part of the INSTC, the counter connectivity project, which runs from St. Petersburg and ends in Mumbai. So the International North-South Transport Corridor will run parallelly to this new deal, and therefore, it could divide countries in a certain way. And because of the conflict, we have seen that even the age-old conflict between the regional partners or regional countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran were always positioned on two sides. Saudi looks itself as the head of the Sunni Islam, and Iran looks itself as the head of the Shia Islam world. And there's this great rift between the two sides. I think that was bridged a lot because of the war. Iran tried to reach out to Saudi
Mhm.
Arabia. Saudi Arabia took a position on Palestine against Israel. All of those. So I think that politics plays into this. That how will this unravel also depends a lot on the intra-regional politics, and therefore Trump at all cost wants a deal to settle, even if it means even if it means, as we saw that in the latest release of the hostages, there were some, unexpected things happening, like the dead bodies of child, etc. So I think the deal should come through is a priority for the Trump administration. So we'll see how this unravels. But I think there are multiple components to whether this can be a successful connectivity project or not.
Given that in the past the US has pressured India over the Chabahar project, do you think that Trump's aspiration for a new nuclear deal with Iran could resolve some of these tensions? Could there be a grand trade bargain that essentially paves the way to this connectivity and erases the current tensions over the Iran, Saudi Arabia, India strategic trade-off? Or do you think that will be still too difficult to overcome given the current context?
I think it's quite possible because if you look at what is happening between US and Russia, US is actually they're sitting on a negotiating table irrespective of Ukraine, and that's a huge deal for Europe. But what it means is the great power relations, the contested great power relations between Russia and the United States is easing, which means that if the gates open to Russia, some gates are likely to open to Russia's partner, Iran. And I think the Trump administration's approach right now is to make nice and bring hostility down. And if he wants the 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 Middle East to be the centerpiece of his connectivity, of his
Mhm.
mega business connectivity deal, then I think he would rather not go for a maximum pressure strategy on Iran and rather ask them, ease some sanctions and ask them to to work with the rest of the countries and not be a threat in that sense. It all depends on how the Israel-Hamas thing goes. But I think broadly, the Trump administration that you see right now is gearing up for an all-out mediation strategy. It is
Mhm.
craving for a deal with China. It is craving for a deal with US at whatever cost. It is craving for a deal in the Middle East. And once the chips may fall where they may, I think the Trump administration will be in a position, or the Trump presidency will be in a position to say, I present to you, I've resolved all the conflicts.
Mhm.
Now let the world decide whether I should get a Nobel Prize or not.
That's fair indeed, but now I kind of want to circle back to the connectivity issue. Seeing that Trump is pursuing diplomatic connectivity on all fronts and with all hostile parties, what is this idea of trying to connect the entire world with the internet, undersea internet cables? What exactly would that accomplish from a technical perspective, and how can the US and its partners guarantee the security of these cables, given that both the Houthis in the Red Sea and the Russia/China operatives in the Baltic Sea have had a great deal of experience of destroying these cables, and one Chinese university reportedly is even teaching publicly how to do that.
So I think that's why you see that the undersea cable of the Indian Ocean region was announced. I don't see the United States particularly sees many hostile powers in the Indian Ocean, and therefore that's a good ground to begin
Mm-hmm.
with. So that is one. But what does it seek to achieve? I think data dominance.
Mm-hmm.
That is what it is seeking to achieve. That is an area where China is taking rapid precedence over the United States in the last decade, technology and data dominance. And the United States government, particularly because of its changing stance on external investment, is not in a position to invest rapidly and justify in the Congress on why it wants data. And therefore, it has pulled major private players like Meta to play this role. If you look at the domestic, I'm sure you're watching the domestic politics of the US. Trump, Trump had sued Meta in a mega billion deal. Meta has actually settled it personally with Trump and has paid a lot of amount as defamation charges to Trump only 2 weeks back. So I think he's looking for a deal. He's looking, and therefore this is also an opportunity for Trump to say to his private players that now I'm giving you a business investment. It also raises the profile of the United States. And because Trump is looking at contracting the military spaces of the US, there is a huge military presence of the US abroad. There is a huge debate in the US whether US should pull back from Germany, Stuttgart, which is one of their primary positions, and what happens to NATO, etc., is a question that follows. But I think if the United States does a military contraction, how does a great power then maintain its influence and power? It's through data, it's through technology, it's through partnerships. And how will it maintain the security of these data cables? It's a great future question, but I think the United States could develop a strategy where it could say that it could divide regions and say that particular countries, a set of countries, are responsible for safety of these cables together. I don't think any one country can guarantee that, and I'm sure, despite guarantees, there will be accidents. But I think the best way to overcome this is to tell to regional countries that these are the cables in your region. Please take care.
So that would require a great deal of multilateral coordination, including with the countries in the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific area. We have seen that there's been a great deal of ups and downs between Trump and Biden on trying to leverage those relationships. Trump has, on the one hand, withdrawn from the TPP. On the other hand, now he's pursuing a grand anti-China, anti-BRI strategy. On the Biden administration has created a multitude of alliances, but none of which have been particularly effective, and the priorities have been questionable. How do you see that bridge being, um, that gap being bridged right now? Who do you think would be those partners? Is Trump going to use old sets of alliances and blocks created by the Biden administration to implement this new vision, or are we seeing a transition to something new and different and a specific grouping based on this particular issue alone?
That's again a great question. I think if you look at the Trump administration, I think the approach would be to deal with these regionally. So I think in the Pacific theater, in the Asia Pacific, and not the entire Indo-Pacific, but the Asia Pacific and partly the Indo-Pacific, some of these alliances or most of these alliances that the Biden administration created will have to sustain even under Trump because of the goals that Trump wants to achieve. One of them is the Pacific is a balance of power advantage over China. So if you seek a balance of power advantage over China in the Pacific, you've got to maintain the South Korea, Philippines, U.S. alliance. You've got to maintain the Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and Australia alliance. You've got to maintain the Quad alliance. I'm calling it alliance just as explainer, but so I think in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, you see that the Trump administration will be compelled by its end game to maintain some of the most of the alliances. If you look at other regions, for example, the Middle East, I think the Trump administration is going to do away with the old structures and say, I'm going to follow my frame. And, he could come up with radical ideas like offering Iran backing off from the maximum pressure strategy and offering a deal to Iran, ease sanctions up on Russia. The great power relations structures is already shaking with the negotiations that have started with Russia. And Latin America. I think Latin America is a great way to show that the Biden framework may not be followed at all. And I think you look at the countries that actually Biden administration pressured a lot. Trump is going easy on them. So if you look at, there is a different approach. Marco Rubio in his second, I think, week or the first week visited El Salvador and, met the leader met Bukele, the leader of the country. That signals to me that there is going to be a renewed approach to Latin America in many ways. There's going to be a pressure strategy asking these smaller nations to take immigrants, etc. But there is a fresh lens to look at that. With big countries like Brazil, I don't think the Biden administration continuity is going to be the same because Trump doesn't look at Lula, who he thinks is a left-oriented guy, in a very good light. And I think the relationship there, his statements against BRICS, etc., is already out for everybody to see. So I think he's going to take a different approach on issues where China, Latin America, and Middle East countries are involved. But perhaps in the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific particularly, some of these continuities will remain.
So let's get back to the aspect of this meta initiative and how it can counter the BRI. Because as far as I see data dominance, well, one of the leading issues of the day, without a doubt, is only one aspect of this. This is the new digital Silk Road, as China calls it. Of course, the Italy/IMEC combo is the attempt to address some of the logistical supply chain elements, but what about everything else? The massive infrastructural investments China has already made and continues to make in the future, the naval pathways that it has established around the world. Is there a plan for that, or are we going to be limited to these couple of highly specific initiatives?
So I think that the Trump administration is looking at a dominance over China in a different way, by way of asking other players to step up in the region and do their bit in terms of how much they can build infrastructure, etc., physically. Now, that before I go on to answer that and elaborate that point, I think if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative's data itself, it is running out of gas in many regions. I mean, it at least slowed down in many, many regions, including Central Asia, including Europe. But be that as it may, the Belt and Road Initiative is really one of the strongest way in which China has connected to almost every part of the world. It is looking at Latin America. It opened the Shanghai port in I think Peru recently, which is by tonnage the largest port in Latin America, and now it belongs to China. So does the US under Trump look to counter that aspect of the physical infrastructure bit? I think at a later stage. At the first, until the until the Trump administration's midterms, which is next year, 2026, I think the focus will really be to create space for cutting on expenses abroad, for cutting on expenses within. And then I think in the second part of the administration, he's going to focus on reviving some of these infrastructure initiatives, pressurizing more partners to do more in terms of physical infrastructure, etc. But right now, I think the idea is to accumulate that resource and power the country's heft to a large extent.
Now, looking at India's role in all of this, this is obviously a great opportunity to kind of step up to become more visible and to project more power, more influence globally. But can India really afford it at this time? Is it something that it is ready to do to the extent that the Trump administration is expecting from it?
So I think there's going to be a bit of a back and forth here. Don't expect, India to lie down and take everything that Trump administration throws at it. For various reasons. One is we have a trade surplus. The last time, if you look at the Trump administration, we actually had retaliatory tariffs on exactly the sectors that the US imposed tariffs on us. That was not a great signaling for a great bilateral relationship. The second term, I think, because for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that most countries, including India, is in a better position to understand what Trump administration is likely to do if we say yes or if we say no. So I think that framework is really helpful in terms of what we can do. The second is, I think that if you look at the campaign speeches, if you look at the approach to India, there is a positivity towards India by the Trump administration. See the aluminum tariffs, India is not there. Look at whenever the number of times he said China, number of times he said India. Look at the Quad meeting. So all the optics around it signals that he's able to work with India. One of the most important things that came out of the joint statement of the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump was the BTA, the bilateral trade agreement, and that the fact that the two sides have committed the highest representatives, and I'm quoting here, the highest senior officials from two sides to actually, come out with a bilateral trade agreement by the fall of 2025. So there is a set deadline. There are high representatives, which means there's a great political will and intent on both sides to be able to come out with something by the fall of 2025 in terms of the bilateral. Now, why is it important? It's important because Trump administration signs bilateral trade agreements very, very rarely. This Trump administration is actually averse to signing bilateral trade agreements. Look at he has taken the NAFTA off. He signed the MCA last time with Canada and Mexico. And in this term, he has scrapped the MCA altogether, which is a revised version of the bilateral trade agreement with two neighboring countries. So I think India is in a much better position that at least the Trump administration has agreed to, talk and figure out a BTA.
And getting back to some of the more technical partnerships and projects announced, how does that fit into this framework, and where do you see it going? How far do you think the two countries can take some of these announcements in the near term?
So I think some of the major announcements was, of course, the 10-year framework that India and the US defense relationship has. So that's a framework that gets extended every 10 years. And why, one of the reasons is that we are not allies. And the second reason, more important reason, is that it's renewed every 10 years because of the challenges of the next decade is taken into account. So I think it's important on what things come in the next framework. So the fact that the United States and India again extended the last framework that was signed in 2015 for 10 years and ended in 20 and is going to end in 2025 has been extended to 2035. Most importantly, that framework is now called the major partner has been inserted. The major partner status of India has been inserted in the title of that framework. Initially, it was without the MDP status. Now, MDP status, the major defense partner status, was given to India in 2016. Most analysts, if you talk to India and say, what does this mean? Most people who look at it closely will tell you that nothing came out of the MDP. It was a
Yes.
nominal thing. But I think the fact that now it's been inserted in the 10-year framework, to my mind, it tells me that there is a new conduit that's going to expand or open up in terms of critical and emerging tech, technology enhancement, sensitive information sharing. All of these are going to be weaved in a much larger way in the defense and security partnership in the next 10 years. So that is one. The second is the critical and emerging tech. I think now it's a part of the Quad grouping, right? The Quad has 16 groups, and I think a couple of them have to do with the critical and emerging tech. Now, the Trump administration has announced that it will bring a couple of new working groups within the Quad. Now, let's wait to see what those are. But I think that is important. The semiconductor cooperation is important. And India has committed 7.35 billion investments in the United States. And I think that placates the Trump administration's anxieties a little bit. So I think if you put all of that together, there is some deadline by the fall of 2025 for some of these announcements to take shape. And some of these will take shape by the end of the year. But by the end of the year, we would be able to see a host of things, new things or new twists between bilateral relations taking shape in many, many, many ways.
From India's perspective, how is this growth in the relationship impacting its own priorities and its own concerns in terms of the geopolitical landscape, in terms of Trump's efforts to create some sort of a positive relationship with China, and in terms of other challenges that are specific to India's interests and may not have anything to do with the United States?
So I think with the US, the relationship is really improving, and that frame allows India in two ways. One is the United States and India relationship is largely working on a very autonomous strategic autonomy frame where India takes independent decisions, and where needed, I think we push back against the US in many ways. And I think that was seen in how India continued to maintain its relationship with Russia throughout the Ukraine-Russia war for the past Biden administration's term. And so with the Trump administration, some of those challenges could magnify or amplify. For instance, if the Trump administration asks India to step up in the Indian Ocean, carry more joint patrol exercises across the Strait of Malacca, so those are challenges that India will have to deal with. There is an anticipation in India that the Quad framework will get more securitized, and that's not a comfortable frame for India to work with. Now, those are challenges that India will have to deal with in terms of, India has been called the weakest link of the Quad because, it has been seen as a player which is preventing Quad from getting securitized against China. I think some of those challenges might amplify during the Trump administration and what it asks India or expects India to do in terms of regional security, in terms of security versus China. The second is how the US-China dynamic plays out is really important. If the US-China relationship really goes south, then I think the challenges magnify for India. But there are also positives. If there is let's say if the tariffs on China go up to 20% or 30% or 40%, then I think the supply chain deflections will mean a lot of benefits for India and Southeast Asia. So I think there are also benefits out of the US-China competition in many ways. So those are some of the phrases. some of the frames that I think are important for India. But regionally, I think India has stepped up in the Western Indian Ocean because of the American pressure for the past 7, 8 years. We have brought down our energy imports from Iran to zero. Uh, Now, virtually, we don't import anything. But if the relationship improves with Russia and Iran for the United States, that might again open up. The INSTC might again pick up. Those are frames that I think will continue. But India's stepping up in the Western Indian Ocean together with the US is a new thing that I think has changed the regional security dimension, primarily because we have signed the 4 foundational agreements with the US, which allows us to move back and forth from, let's say, a port of US and a port of India. So between Djibouti and Visakhapatnam or Djibouti and Mumbai, there's a lot of back and forth now, refueling, joint exercises, joint patrolling, exchange of intelligence information. All of these are much more magnified than in the past. And I don't think that would mean anything less for regional security.
In terms of interoperability of regional forces, meaning aside from the actual technical agreements about production of technologies or sales of defense technologies and things like that, are we seeing increased training and increased exchanges that would allow American and Indian forces, and not just military forces, but various types of personnel to work closer together and kind of overcome the gap in different experiences and approaches?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a path that's northwards. If you look at the joint training between the two sides, that has increased substantively. If you look at the sophistication of exercises like the Tiger Trump, like the bilateral exercises, and I think today, India and the US, statistically speaking, conduct the most number of military exercises than any 2 countries in the world. And that's a fact. So I think in terms of joint training, joint exercises, things have moved up much ahead. We also, I mean, I don't think it's common knowledge, but I think we train US forces in Manipur, in Northeast, in guerrilla warfare, in the jungles. There is a particular school where we do that. All of that, I think, is very important in terms of personnel exchanges, etc. So broadly, yes, we also passed real-time information from the information center in the Indian Ocean, just outside Delhi, the information center for Indian Ocean. There are liaison officers of about 30 countries, if I'm not mistaken, and the United States has about 2 or 3 liaison officers, and real-time information about white shipping and container shipping is relayed back to the US in real time about what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's a great degree of coordination now. There's this, as I said at the beginning, that it's now very structural in terms of information sharing. So we have actually leaped ahead in terms of the information sharing, joint exercises, etc. Refueling is now a big part of the exchange between the 2 countries, and docking. I think docking is one of the most important. We actually now Indian ships and the US ships go back to each other's ports and then dock for longer than before. And finally, one of the most important things that this joint statements, to my mind, makes about the interoperability is that both countries are looking at and I'm quoting, roughly paraphrasing what it says, that both countries are looking to support each other's military presence throughout the Indo-Pacific. Now, that's new to me. What does that mean? Will unravel in the next few years. But I think it's an important change from the past that both countries will now perhaps venture out and support each other in terms of supporting each other's military.
Well, that's definitely a positive development. If nothing else, I think even the optics of it are at least positive, no matter what direction it ultimately takes. But one of the most eye-catching moments of this visit, of course, was the suggestion for the F-35 sale, both in terms of its symbolic value and, of course, the magnitude of the actual sale. Can you tell us what challenges lie before something like that can be finalized? And on the other hand, is it really advantageous from a practical point of view, other than underscoring the growing trust between US and India?
So I think F-35 offer from Trump was a shock and awe strategy to catch India off guard and say that here this is on the table, take it. And so I think that was a little surprising to me because if it's not without precedence. India has been offered the F-16 with its facility, but India said no in the past because F-16 had a different story because the Pakistanis had it, so there was no strategic edge that we would
Mhm.
have by keeping 16. Also, the it was a fourth generation aircraft, so to open a facility of a fourth generation aircraft when countries were already moving ahead on fifth generation was not so much of a beneficial deal. But F-35 is a completely different ball game altogether. I mean, it's the most advanced aircraft in many ways, in stealth, in speed, etc. But two or three things. One is the pricing. I think the question is if F-35 is passed on to India, and supposing in a hypothetical world, if India decides to buy F-35s, how much will be the end use monitoring? I think that's the concern for India. The end use monitoring, if you look at the Israelis buying F-35, the end use monitoring is very less. But because India is a country which works with Russian systems, the end use
Mhm.
monitoring is going to be very high. So I think that's one of the first questions that comes to my mind. And with a lot of end use monitoring, Indian forces, Indian government will not be able to, you will not be very keen on taking that. Second, the price. It's very high per piece. F-35 is the costliest system that we have right now. The third, does Indian armed forces need it? Now, the Indian government will have a conversation with the Indian armed forces and then probably come to a conclusion because the joint statement does say fifth generation aircraft cooperation with the US, which only means F-35. I don't think there is any other fifth generation in the US. So essentially, I think the talks can begin, and then the armed forces will have the eventual final call on whether F-35s can have a strategic advantage vis-a-vis China. I mean, China is the predominant threat that we are facing now, and basically a comparison with the Rafales that we buy from France at this point, and see the strategic, the cost, and other pros and cons of between the two countries, and then come to a decision whether we want to buy it or not. The final point on this is that, to my mind, I think F-35s are great, but India does India need F-35 squadrons at this point, or does it take a lot of ISR capabilities? Does it buy more C-30s, C-130s? Does it buy more Poseidon P-8I, of which six have been announced? Six additional P-8Is have been announced in the joint statement. Do we buy more P-8Is and create more impact in the Indo-Pacific in terms of ISR, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance? Or do we go for F-35s and just place them and wait for a combat to happen? I think that's the question to my mind.
So here's a counter question to respond to that, and leaving aside Trump's, shock and awe tactics from a longer strategic point of view, is there an advantage for India to enter the circle of countries that already share F-35? Would that enhance cooperation not just with the US but with those other um countries? And do you think there is an underlying effort to get India to sort of wean itself off the Russian systems?
Right. I mean, so if it buys F-35, it is certainly in the select few concentric circles of countries that operate it, and it'll be weaved into that maintenance and repair system of only a few countries, for example, Japan, Israel, etc., and more partners of the US. Even NATO partners like Turkey haven't been given the F-35. So I think it really means a lot that F-35 has been offered to India strategically. But in terms of India's own needs, I think weaning away from Russia is not as much of a concern as its own self-reliance. So
Mhm.
India has been working for a long time on developing its own internal self-reliant ecosystem, defense ecosystem. Now, the first AMCA, which is the medium range aircraft that we have, Tejas, has actually an American engine, right? So that took about 2.5, 3 decades. Now, I don't think India has that kind of a and that kind of time really. But so there are
Mhm.
two options. One is for now you can go for F-35s, or the counter machines are Sukhoi 57, which is much less costly, or costs much less than the American systems. But again, I mean, if you compare the stealth, the speed, there is, analysts will tell you that the two systems compare very differently. Now, so those are the questions to my mind. So if you're because we have launched the Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is the self-reliant India initiative for the defense ecosystem, and then you go on to buy a lot of F-35s from the US, then what does it do for your own
Mhm.
domestic manufacturing? That's one question. The
Mhm.
second is, what are your immediate threats? It's China, it's Pakistan, etc. Do you have the wherewithal internally to be able to produce and make up for the systems if you don't take F-35s and if you don't take the fifth generation? Probably not. So I think those are the questions to my mind, and I think the government's mind to be able to come up with a decision on F-35.
Finally, I would be remiss if I did not touch on Elon Musk and some of the private agreements that are being advanced and pushed. Of course, we're seeing the efforts already very quickly to discuss the Tesla facilities and production. And we also know that in the past, Musk sought to bring Starlink into India only to see the India's reliance company as a roadblock and competition. What can we make from this meeting with the Elon Musk, and what can we expect from the private sector of the U.S. companies in the future? And are those things going to be complementing or displacing prior private investments backed by the United States, such as Microsoft, etc.?
So so I think the Musk angle is very interesting in many ways, because if you look at the statements coming out from from Elon Musk, who's people have doubted his intentions about China, because Tesla has a huge investment in China. But over the past few weeks, the tenor and the tone of Elon Musk has changed vis-a-vis China. He's looking for other markets, and therefore India becomes very important. Because clearly there's a pressure from within the Trump administration to say no to China in many ways, and he will need other markets to come out of there. So India becomes important. India is 1.45 billion people, is not within Tesla's range, is not within Starlink's range. So I think it's a huge loss as a business person, it's a huge loss for Elon Musk, and is gunning for it. But the second thing is, for India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat, or the self-reliant India initiative, actually, the red lines are clear. The government says that if you come here, your manufacturing will have to be with a local partner. That's true for Boeing, that's true for Lockheed Martin, that's true. So I don't see the Indian government making an exception for Tesla unless something really starkly changes. Um, and the BYD, the Chinese EV company, which makes the BYD car, also faces the same problem. The government they bought a land before COVID, and then obviously China and India had a clash at the border, and then everything changed. But that land still is frozen,
Hmm.
because India asked BYD to, if you want to manufacture here, you will have to do with a local company, and that's the rule. So I think those are the questions for Tesla to decide. If it really
Yeah.
wants to come in and dominate this system unilaterally, I don't think that's possible.
Mhm.
It will have to compete on a fair market, on a fair basis. And interestingly, many of the Indian companies, for example, Reliance, you mentioned, and Airtel, which is one of the telecom companies, have actually, have announced that they're going to buy the satellite spectrum. So they are entering this bid. Even if Tesla comes, I think that competition has started in India. So it'll be interesting to see whose services are better, and if the Elon Musk, if at all Elon Musk has decided to come in, and the gates are open. But I think it's not going to be so easy, because even Elon Musk has decided that he will do business on his own terms, and we all know him, how he functions. So I think it's
Mhm.
going to be a tough negotiation there.
Mhm. And there is another aspect to all of this, which is a lot of people like Musk, not just him, but many actually, they have combined the tech capabilities, AI sector, energy sector, alternative energy, and even nuclear in some cases, and needs and data collection, data centers into one mega cartel aspiration, and we're seeing several U.S. tech companies go in that direction. Given India's breakthrough on the nuclear front as one of the leading powers in the respect, and the past negotiations between the US and India on energy, and at the same time these private initiatives by Musk like types of investors. Where do you see this general mega sector going? Do you see India attempt something like that on its own? Do you see some sort of a combined effort with the US, or do you see that not being a priority in the foreseeable future?
So I think, on a lighter note, the technocracy that you're talking about, India has exported most of the technocrats to the US. So let them deal with that. Uh, but I think broadly, I don't see that difference, that government really opening that much of a space in India to technocrats. I think we invite people to come back, but I think the kind of salary, the kind of aspiration that they see in the US is probably not. I mean, India is a picking up space. It has covered the ground, but I think that it has a lot more to go there. But so I see that difference really impacting many ways in which India functions, and is not going to be the same level of conglomerate technocracy as we see in the US. I think there's going to be much of a difference between how we function and how the United States functions, because I don't see any. I mean, there are private investors who have risen to that level. For example, the Ambanis and the Adanis, and but they have mostly done. It's not a control of the government thing like Elon Musk. It's a completely different entity. The government criticizes these investors, and so there is a much more free flow of narrative here.
Hmm. And finally, in terms of energy agreements, do you see anything major coming out? Do you see things pretty much going as they did, or do you see that in the near future there's going to be some major shift?
So there's going to be major shifts, I think, because he's announced that the fact that Donald Trump has announced that US is going to rise as the largest energy and crude supplier to India, which means that there's going to be pressure, which is going to follow in terms of the fact that Trump is going to say to India, buy more oil. The question to my mind is, at what price? Will it be the same pricing as Russia? Probably
Probably
not.
not.
So, so the question is, then what do? You buy more oil from the US at a higher price when you can buy that from other players. But I think some of those devilish choices you have to make
Hmm.
because you're a partner with the United States. The same kind that we did with Iran. I think we brought down our imports from Iran and brought up and took up the imports from the US. So I think some of those deals will be worked out. The second, I think, aspect. So, and a related aspect is the supply chain issues. There will be
True.
newer supply chain created. There will be newer routes created, and connectivity projects, etc. The second most aspect in terms of important aspect in terms of energy was the announcement of the nuclear modular reactors that India and the US will build together now. So it means basically that US companies will come to India and build modular nuclear reactors. Now, why have we agreed at this? Is because of the 123 agreement that was signed between the two countries for the civil nuclear pact, to allow India, which is a non-signatory of the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, uh, to get the nuclear fuel. Now, when this was signed, there was a liability clause within India, which involves a lot of bureaucracy and red tapeism, which is how to acquire land, and how, because it's a nuclear facility is going to be built, there's going to be a lot of laws in terms of radiation, in terms of where it is situated, how the land is acquired, how much compensation is made, who will build the reactors, etc. Now, I will not go into the whole story of the Westinghouse, which is a US company and
Hmm.
had shown bankruptcy, etc. But the
Mm-hmm.
point is that the small modular nuclear reactors now allows you to circumvent that legality and the bureaucracy and the matrix of bureaucracy. So small modular reactors will not require so much of regulation and can be made at easier level than before, in simple terms. So I think we have circumvented that problem and yet can achieve the energy deficit that we have on both sides. So US companies get to come here, invest, and build such reactors. India gets energy in terms and clean energy and actually covers that gap of the SDG that we have, the development goals. By 2070, we have committed a zero emission, and I think it's really high time we need it.
So, where do you think India going in terms of electrification, in terms of meeting its energy needs in the next few years?
I think India is already going clean in a mega way. The solar is one of the largest pitches of India. If you look at the Western, I think the world's largest solar field is in India. It overtook something in California, somewhere in California, I think 3 or 4 years back. In Gujarat, there's the largest solar. So we have pitched up on the solar. The government has subsidized putting up solar panels on your roof for every civilian. So you can approach, there are programs, you can approach the government, get the solar panels installed on your roof, and for much less money than you would do it independently. So the government helps there. So electrification is not an issue. I think clean energy is an issue where we are moving in that direction. So nuclear energy is something that we are going back to. But I think because if we have to support the kind of population, which is the largest country on earth, I think we will have to diversify energy needs and go part of it into nuclear. But still, I think the wind and solar still take the larger chunk than nuclear. Currently, the numbers may be differently placed, but I think the ambition is to place nuclear at the lower end of the table and take solar and wind. And the one last thing where solar energy is so important for India because it has already pitched the ISA, the International Solar Alliance,
Mm-hmm.
where India and France together pitched it at the UN, and now I think there are more than 100 countries and members, particularly in the equator zone of Earth, where largest sunshine
Yeah.
happens. So I think we've pulled together a host of countries to be able to show this initiative, to be able to implement this initiative of higher reliance on solar energy. So those are some of the glimpses of what India is doing in energy. But I think in terms of India-US relationship, clean energy is something that we both want to achieve and move forward on.
Now that the visit has been concluded, these important takeaways are being processed. What's next in terms of the high level meetings? Will Donald Trump be eventually visiting India, or is the next step some big summit at some neutral territory or major gathering that we expect the two leaders to meet next?
So with Trump, you never know, right? I mean, he can just tell you tomorrow that he's meeting somewhere, Mr. Modi in India. But jokes apart, I think the India is hosting Donald Trump potentially. If we hear that he's going to come in September of this year, where the Quad Summit will be held, the Quad Leaders Summit will be held. It's
Mhm.
important because the last one was held at Biden's home in Wilmington, Delaware. And this one is important because Trump is going to announce, as the joint statement says, a few more additional components or working groups in Quad. It's interesting to see which ones because I think security, there is an emphasis, there could be an emphasis on security, and everybody will be keenly watching on what impact does it have on regional security and the China angle. So that really is something that everybody is looking at. But I think before that, the foreign ministers, I'm sure, will meet somewhere or the other. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Jaishankar, the Foreign Minister, who frequents US more than any other person in the government. So I think that there's that chance.
Well, there's definitely a lot to look forward to in the near future, and time will tell where it all takes us, but hopefully someplace great. Thank you so much for joining us and for offering these very important insights and quite unique insights, by the way. Unfortunately, the US analysts have been kind of missing the boat on this important issue, and I'm glad that you are filling in those information gaps for us. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next Tuesday night, 9 p.m. The Washington Outside Report on the Coalition Radio. And this was Dr. Vivek Mishra from the Observer. Uh, with the laboratory with the insights concerning Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to the United States and the future of US-India diplomacy, at least for the next 4 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Irina. It was such a pleasure.